I want to be clear. We are not saying throw caution to the wind and just go forward and violate all laws. That's not what anybody here is saying. And I do think that there is a healthy debate, or there should be a healthy debate among Christians as to where that line is, where disobedience to or rebellion against a law is sinful, okay? But what is completely irrefutable is to assume that any disobedience of the law is sinful. That is incorrect. So this is the question of the day, and I think it's important. I'll get into the context of it. What do you, especially with COVID-19, with coronavirus, Wu flu, Chinese virus, whatever you want. I call it Chinese virus. You call it whatever you want.
Truth.
Where do you think the line is drawn between respecting the law of man and the law of God? As Christians out there, I've gotten a lot of letters to this effect. Well, what do we do when there are these laws that are either unconstitutional or are abusive of our civil rights, of our human rights, but it's the law of the land, because that's something that a lot of Christians believe, of course, that all power is sort of is given by God, because God obviously, He knows a lot.
He had it all.
He's around all the time. And let me tell you where this comes from, actually. In Michigan, I was in Michigan, I've talked about this recently, and there's a real culture of fear there, as opposed to here. And a pastor of a church, where I got married, actually, they could very easily practice a social distancing guidelines.
They're a small church.
It's a small church, and they could still carry on services, but it's not allowed. It's illegal. And even then, they're not supposed to be having small group meetings, where he has it with 5 guys in houses, and that's effectively illegal. But they've all decided that they're willing to do it anyway. And I was sitting there going, that's almost, drawing half the Christian fish at that point. And where do you line up on that? It's the law of the land. If you're in Michigan and you have, fascist wicked wench of the West, Whitmer, telling you that you can't have a small group in a house as a Christian, is it your job to say, well, I have to submit to the authority of the government, or is that at a certain point undercutting God's law? And I think it's something that a lot of Christians get wrong. I hate to use this word, nuanced. There are some situations here, and I think we'll get into it, that are nuanced, but there are some concepts that are irrefutable that I think a lot of Christians miss. So before we get to it, where do you guys line up here?
Well, and I think it's a really good question, because there are a lot of churches across the nation that are in states that are locking it down or giving them some openness to say, hey, you can do this, but congregation members are saying, well, we shouldn't be doing this. No, we should be doing this. So it's a kind of a schism all over the place, even if you're not in a place that is being run like Michigan is, unfortunately. So I would say that...
No, unfortunately, how Michigan is run. Not if you're in a place that is not Michigan.
No, unfortunately, yes, exactly. It's poorly run.
Of all the states to be,
you're there,
New York and Michigan are the most unfortunate.
Yes, very unfortunate.
Where do you line up there?
Yeah, so I guess it really brings up a question of like lineups of authority, right? So I mean, there are several different ways of thinking about authority. There's like the Roman Catholic position, which would be like that the church is over the state, and the state should submit to the church's authority. There's the Erastian position after Thomas Erastus, the state is over the church. And then my position would be like the sphere sovereignty, Abraham Kuyper's position, that the family, the church, and the state are in their separate spheres of authority, and that they're all under God. So they've got their lanes, and that they shouldn't cross over.
And also, by the way, that's important for people to understand. That's, if you look at the Founding Fathers and how they intended for, well, we're talking about government, what the legitimate authority is of the land here. They believe that the family is the central building block before communal government, before municipal government, before state government, before federal government. You needed to have a central family. So that's why we do have marriage laws in the books. And I understand, I don't think that the government should be in the church running business, but I also don't think that marriage is a fundamental human right. It's a contract. If you find someone who is willing to take you, don't know how I did it. But that is the central role of the family is to self-govern. It doesn't take a village, it takes a family. And then hopefully a village. And then hopefully a state. And then hopefully the federal government. But the idea that the village supersedes the rights of the family, no, that's why we have the Constitution. That's why powers were delegated. So to speak, to sort of bridge that between different theological worldviews and how it relates to the Christian worldview. That's also why a lot of founding fathers, people aren't going to like this, but they were very leery of Catholics signing the Declaration of Independence, and not because, but because they believed that they might have a higher allegiance sworn to the Vatican, to Rome, which was, keep in mind too, is also it's a governing body, effectively.
And
it's not just a religious institution, and they were really pretty apprehensive about that.
And there's good reason for that fear, because that's exactly what happened in Europe in pretty much every country. Right. So there was much more authority vested in the Vatican and even kings what they do. At some points during history. And so I think a good place for us to start is that there are, we're not inciting Christians to go and overthrow, and we're not inciting Christians to be pacifists either, right? So we're getting rid of the extremes. A very good example that came to mind of when it would be absolutely appropriate was in the book of Daniel, where their prayer was basically forbidden, right? So I didn't put this verse in here. I'm just going to talk through it.
Oh, so you wanted to trick us.
Yes, pretty much. So you're
going to lead with something you didn't tell us before.
Exactly. I got to keep something out of Discovery so you guys don't have it.
Do you want to deliver your point in Aramaic?
Pretty much. I prefer Latin if you don't mind. But essentially, prayer is outlawed, and Daniel continues to pray, right? And he suffers the consequences of that, and God delivers him from the lion's den. That's kind of how the whole story of the lion's den starts. The next part is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are told that they have to worship the king, and they say, we're not going to worship you, right? And no matter what happens to us, we're still not going to do this. So that's a very clear situation where the rules of man violate clearly the rules of God, right? You're supposed to be able to pray to God, and you're not supposed to worship any gods before God. So that's a very clear example of when you can, right? Well, what's less clear is the question we're on right now. Can a church stay open when the government orders them closed in a situation like this where there's a virus or a pandemic?
And I'm not just talking about churches. I'm also talking about laws that violate your basic human rights to sovereignty. In other words, a law that violates your right to go make a living. For example, let's say you're a fisherman in Michigan and you can't go out there because there's an outboard motor.
Yes.
God forbid. Even though you're several miles from anyone, you can be wearing a mask in the middle of the water. I think they may have changed that now. It's hard. They're kind of going, oh, hold on a second. Ring, ring, red telephone. Sorry, we were wrong about that. People can be 800 yards from anyone else on a boat, and it doesn't matter if they have a diesel engine. Okay, got it. Okay, you don't have to be destitute anymore.
You're forgetting human-to-fish transmission. It's well documented without a mask.
Frickin' zebra muscles.
Within the state's authority, at least here in the U.S., we have several levels of authority. Right. So if I'm dealing with somebody, so let's say I'm holding a church service, I've got a police officer who comes up and says, you can't do this small group, you can't have this church service, that sort of thing. There are obviously several levels of authority that he appeals to, so that I could appeal to that over that. And then in that sort of situation, it's really a matter of cost-benefit analysis, right? So is the cost of sticking to my guns worth?
Are you willing to go
I think
through
it comes down to two
tasks?
things. It comes down to understanding what God's commandment is to you, and then also understanding what is a legitimate role of government in the United States. Because, for example, we have 50 states, right? This isn't the same kind of scenario that you maybe had back in the day. If you're going back to, maybe if you're going back to the cradle of civilization, if you're
whatever day you're going back to.
Wherever you want to go back to, we have a huge country with 50 states, and we do have a constitution. So you need to understand what God calls you to do, which is obey the law of the land, provided that it does not try to usurp God's law. Then you need to understand that states, all powers not expressly outlined in the Constitution, are delegated to the states. Now, what does that mean? That means that the states have no, but on the flip side of it, this is where sometimes libertarians don't focus on this enough. On the flip side of it, that means that states do not have the right to infringe on your rights. For example, the First Amendment, that's not delegated to the states. A state doesn't have the right to tell you, no, you can't peaceably assemble, no, you can't speak freely. They don't have the right. That's the law of the land. Now, there can be a tyrant in a state who wants to say, you can't actually speak freely. That's not a legitimate law. The Second Amendment, they do not have the right to infringe upon your Second Amendment. Now, I don't want to but I believe in constitutional carry because you have the right to keep and bear arms. That's one to me that is so far gone. It is unconstitutional. The state does not have the right to step in and tell you cannot exercise your Second Amendment right. If you are honoring the law of the land, you need to know the law of the land, because laws of the land can be subverted by people who don't have the authority to enforce that law. So you need to understand God's law, what's expected of you, how he expects you to submit to authority, and then the legitimate law of the land. Because you're saying, well, God expects me to submit to the authority, and the authority, meaning, I don't know, Governor Whitmer says no church or small groups. That's not the law of the land.
Right.
Or the governor of, I don't know, let's pick any crappy state, Vermont, says, well, sorry, you actually can no longer assemble and protest. And some states are trying to do that now, by the way.
Right.
Because they're trying to say you can't protest because it violates social distancing. They don't have the right to. You're not violating the law of the land if you show up, and don't show up with AR-15s and walk into a Senate house. That's not a law thing. It is legal, but optics, not great.
doesn't get your point across.
You are
any better.
not violating the law of the land if you have a governor who tries to step in and create new laws that they don't
Right.
have the authority to create. That is very clearly outlined not only by the Constitution, but the supporting founding documents. So those two elements, I think, make this, where we talk about the nuance, makes those portions pretty clear.
Right, and I think it's a good point to delineate, and I think this leads right into one of the verses that you were actually referencing, which was Matthew 12, right? And so if you want to go through that,
let me do
it
that.
actually talks a little bit about that.
Matthew 12, I don't know which version was printed here. It's the new Crowder version. By the way,
Oh, wow.
I'm going to get
hey.
a better one. I'm getting it custom made. This is
Oh,
So this just off the shelf cross,
Sorry,
it's not
Lord.
good enough for you.
Hey, do you notice? Do you notice? There's no Christ.
Oh,
Why
that's
is it
gone.
gone?
He's kind of the key to the story.
Wow,
Yeah.
interesting.
He's up there.
We are
If I-
so getting
That's
letters.
the important part.
Can you imagine if he was still on there and he came back? Stephen, what?
He's like, did you miss a couple
Come
of words?
on, put your hand in there. Put your hand in there. What? I know, right? What are you telling me? I'm not on that thing. Sorry, Jesus.
Not your best impression.
No,
I
it's
gotta
not.
say.
What is it? It's Jesus Seinfeld? No cross. That's
love it.
literally the last place I want to be. But I did it anyway. I did it for you. I got on the cross. Matthew 12.
Oh.
So this is about, if you don't know, this is about Jesus doing work on the Sabbath.
Nah.
Okay. At the time Jesus went through the grain field on the Sabbath, his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Something important here while we provide some context. Pharisees, not just religious leaders.
Right.
You're talking about people who were part of the political ruling class.
Yeah.
When you look at Pharisees and Sadducees, and I know some areas, yes, they had authority, some areas they didn't, but we need to understand, kind of like with Martin Luther and the original The Diets, which is a very confusing term. This was a rebellion against a political ruling class. And that's why the First Amendment, the idea that the government shouldn't be in the church running business, is so important to avoid a situation like this where the Pharisees and Sadducees were looking to lawyer Jesus into execution by violating the law.
exactly.
Okay. So the Pharisees said, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had not known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And depending on which book you're actually going into in the Bible, he says that it is. I believe he says it's lawful to do good in the Sabbath.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
he asked the question.
There are a
too.
couple of things. This is why I think this is so important. When we talk about Islam versus Christianity forever, I say go back to the founders of the feast. Go back to Christ and Muhammad. Because we can find examples of other early Christians, and not only in the Bible, but outside the Bible. I mean, I don't know why my parents were kind of lining me up for failure, naming me after the first martyr. It happened.
I think it was a PH Stephen, though.
Yeah,
so
it was.
They veered a little.
They wanted to cover their tracks. So I know we can find a lot of examples of Christians who were in trouble violating the law, but they may be wrong.
It's very possible.
So let's go to Christ. Christ clearly violated the law here in several ways, right? Now, is Christ wrong? Did he sin? Well, if Jesus Christ sinned, so in other words, if violating the law is sinful, you have to throw the whole thing out.
Yeah.
You have to
We're
throw the
all
whole
done
Bible
here.
out. Is Jesus sinful? He's not a savior. Spotless lamb.
Can't use it.
You can't use it. So obviously, no, this was not sinful because Jesus did not sin. And again, people, if you're watching this and you're not a Christian, you're going, "Oh, Jesus wasn't." I don't care. This isn't for you. So,
Well, it's not circular logic either.
no,
we'll get into
it's not circular logic. So here's what's important here. Two different dynamics that I think are interesting to sort of take a look at. I shouldn't have said take a look at. Now I sound like you. At which we can observe.
Ooh.
We have
which we
the
can
dynamic of man's law versus God's law. Okay? So we have the law of the land, which is don't do any work on the Sabbath. That's the law of the land, and you have a Pharisee, like we talked about, part of the religious and political ruling class saying, are you breaking the law because they're looking for a reason to put him to death?
Absolutely.
So then you have man's law versus God's law, and he's saying, no, actually it is lawful to do good in the Sabbath. But here's something else that's interesting to me, is this also gives us an example of God's law and the letter of God's law versus the spirit and purpose of God's law. Because you know what other law Christ violated here? God's law.
Yeah.
about the Sabbath. In other words, you could say he violated the law by working on the Sabbath. So is it a sin for somebody to serve others on the Sabbath? And this is even a bigger conversation where are we still beholden to the law? Are we free from it because Christ said he came to fulfill the law? We want to talk about going several layers deep. Right.
Just read Romans.
But in this instance, no, of course not. That means that it is not it's not sinful to violate God's law as it was interpreted at that point.
Yeah.
Why? Because he wanted to, or he violated the letter of God's law, which is don't do anything on the Sabbath. But don't do anything on the Sabbath and shave your neck with electric, and this can be a straight blade. What are you talking about? That wasn't God's intent for the law. The intent and the purpose, the spirit of the law was a gift to us in the Sabbath. And so he was very clear and said, it is good to do good on the Sabbath. So he violated the letter of God's law, how it was outlined by religious leaders and institutions of the day to fulfill the spirit of God's law, which was loving his neighbor. And we can go to the Good Samaritan story there, where who is my neighbor? And he was brilliant using that. He was the first Socrates, if you look at it back then. You look at how he used the Socratic method and turned it back on people. The reason he did that a lot, again, context, is not that he wasn't answering the question. He was trying to avoid being crucified immediately before fulfilling his purpose, because they were always trying to catch him.
Well, and he was definitely breaking their interpretation of the law for sure. Right. And also the last verse you read there, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Right. It is an authority question. So so basically he's saying you're talking to the guy who gave you the Sabbath. So
there's something more important here.
I actually can tell you what it means and what it doesn't mean. So don't tell me what I meant when I said that.
So and that goes back to your point about the Second Amendment. So what Jesus did is exactly like a government coming in and saying that you cannot possess a firearm. The Second Amendment doesn't exist.
Well, can we pause? I just want to finish my one point. I want to go to that. So here's one thing, because there are different, like we talked about, the different layers, nuances. I know you speak Aramaic and Latin and Greek.
Yeah.
Culture. But, and I want to be clear, we are not saying throw caution to the wind and just go forward and violate all laws. That's not what anybody here is saying. And I do think that there is a healthy debate, or there should be a healthy debate among Christians as to where that line is, where disobedience to or rebellion against a law is sinful, okay? But what is completely irrefutable is to assume that any disobedience of the law is sinful. That is incorrect, because Jesus disobeyed the law several times. So the Christians who line up, and anytime you break the law, that's a sin. That is verifiably false, entirely false, according to what the Bible tells us, because Jesus was sinless, and he did it not only here, repeatedly. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, subscribe or hit the notification bell and hit all notifications, because not all notifications work now if you just hit the normal notification bell. I think there's some videos playing in boxes. But of course, do consider subscribing at louderwithcrowder.com/mugclub, because there's a bunch of content that could never make it onto YouTube. And I think the box is playing, there's a video playing in a box with